A lot of people would say choosing between the M2 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Pro is easy, and they'd be right if this was last year when the MacBook Air cost $300 less. But this year, it is different and way more difficult. Not only did Apple raise their prices by $200 for the M2 MacBook Air, because they're currently still selling the M1, which saturates the lineup, but we'll talk about that later. But if you upgrade the 8-core graphics to the same 10 cores that comes with the M2 MacBook Pro, it is the same $1,300 price tag. And with the M2 MacBook Pro having a cooling fan for optimum performance with the new chip, it seems like the regular choice for content creators and designers. Well, not quite, if I am being honest. Now, I'm going to try and explain the differences between these two laptops from an everyday perspective as an MBA student and a web video producer, and give my opinion on which exactly you should be buying depending on the best use case. Now let's start this off with the design. The M2 MacBook Air has a design refresh for going the wedge-shaped design and changing to be similar to the current design language from Apple. The M2 Pro, on the other hand, looks exactly the same as it did all the way back in 2016. It has the standard two colors, that's a space gray and a silver, that hasn't changed at all. Compare that to the M2 MacBook Air, and this comes in 4 different colors, the usual space gray and silver, but this time it also has starlight and midnight. Pro tip: while the midnight color is pretty sweet, it leaves a lot of smudges and marks and might need to be cleaned every now and then. The starlight color, on the other hand, is the most consistent in hiding all the smudges that may occur. But looking at them side by side, you won't really be able to tell the difference because of the MacBook Pro's tapered sides. But what you will notice is the weight. The M2 MacBook Air is lighter at 2.7 pounds, while the MacBook Pro is 3 pounds. Now, it's not a lot, but it's still a significant difference. But if I'm being honest, none of these things I just mentioned should sway your decision. A huge but not so huge difference between these two laptops is the display. The MacBook Air from time had always had not so good displays in multiple ways, but not with the current M2 model. It is now larger with a 13.6-inch display. The notch gives it more screen real estate with thinner bezels and more vertical space. Now, because the M2 MacBook Air is following Apple's current design language for their laptops, this makes the MacBook Pro look outdated. It has super thick bezels, but no, that's not even the worst part. The MacBook Pro still supports 16.7 million colors compared to the billion that's on the MacBook Air, which Apple very conveniently left out when putting these laptops side by side on their website. You only find it if you do individual comparisons and details. So if you are looking for a better display, then the M2 MacBook Air is definitely a no-brainer. Now, even though I hate the notch because I think it's rather unnecessary, it still houses the 1080p camera, which lets in more light and twice the resolution than the MacBook Pro's 6-year-old 720p camera, which looks kind of worse when putting it side by side. Honestly, in 2022, Apple have no right to be releasing a 720p camera with a new laptop. When it comes to the speakers, the MacBook Air no longer has speaker holes on the side of the keyboard like the MacBook Pro. Apple has upgraded it to a 4-speaker system that sounds a whole lot better. I also feel they sound a lot better than the M2 MacBook Pro. One area the M2 MacBook Pro was significantly better is the battery life because of its bigger battery. This year, Apple made the battery on the M2 MacBook Air 5% larger, but kept the rating exactly the same. So you still get 2 extra hours of rated battery life increase for simple tasks. But between these two right now, the battery life is kind of on par, because when battery life is so good, you tend to forget if it's 18 hours or 20 hours of playback. Since we're on the topic of battery life, the M2 MacBook Air now has fast charging. So that charges to about 50% in 30 minutes, while on the Pro with the same charger, it took about an hour to get to 50%. So even with the same charger, even with the same 67 watts, the M2 MacBook Pro does not support fast charging. MagSafe is also a pretty convenient charger to have, and not only does it attach itself magnetically, it frees up 2 extra USB-C ports for connecting an SD card reader or even your phone. An issue I have with both these laptops is something I mentioned in my initial review. The MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro have only Thunderbolt 3 ports, and I'm not sure why that is, because the 14-inch Pro laptops have Thunderbolt 4 ports, which also means that the M2 MacBook Air and Pro will only export to a single display. While these may not be an issue to some people, if you work from home or you're managing any projects or you work in tech or you just like to multitask a lot, this will hinder your productivity a lot of the time. Now you may say, Apple did not market the M2 as a pro laptop, but come on, there are laptops out there that are half the price of the M2 and provide this feature. But an M2 laptop that has a hard time throttling or even overheating can't support a dual screen. You know, that is kind of a deciding factor if we're being honest. So if you want to have a dual screen, then you may want to consider another laptop entirely. If you are someone that loves the touch bar, then the M2 MacBook Pro is literally the only MacBook left with this feature. I understand some people prefer physical keys, and I am one of them sometimes, but the touch bar does come in handy every now and then. So if you know you like this, you might want to keep that in mind when trying to make a purchase decision. Now let's get into performance and what it means to be a Pro or Air model laptop. As we already know, the M2 MacBook Air does not have a fan, so there's this idea that it throttles when it overheats. Well, you have to really, and I mean you have to really try to overheat this by running various benchmark tests back to back. Now, if you review devices, sure, that will most likely happen, but an everyday passive user is not going to do that. Now, even when editing with all the clips and all the overlays on top of each other in Final Cut Pro, the CPU did not throttle once, and that was pretty good. Now, I have used both these laptops for my everyday use and even exporting, and the difference between them in terms of exporting time isn't so much. The MacBook Pro was 3 minutes faster than the Air when exporting a video. While that is obviously better performance, is that enough for most people? Maybe. But unless you literally are watching the export time side by side, you will care. If not, you're just going to be going about your day till it finishes. But I will say this though, if you're going to be rendering and exporting long form videos, then the M2 MacBook Pro is definitely better. On to more things I liked about the M2 MacBook Air and the Pro is the keyboard. While that may seem trivial to some people, to me, the keyboard is one of the most imperative features when choosing a laptop, especially as a content creator and an MBA student. And the keyboard here is pretty good. It adds to the awesome keyboard on the M1 Air and the M1 MacBook Pro. Between these two though, they're both great and are easily on par with each other. So the million-dollar question, which should you choose between the M2 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Pro? If this were an individual review, I wouldn't even recommend the M2 MacBook Air because I still think the M1 is better value. But when compared to the M2 MacBook Pro, the Air is definitely better. It is a brand new laptop with an updated design. It has almost the same battery and performance. It has a better display with a better camera. It comes with MagSafe, and most important of all, it has fast charging, whereas the Pro has a slightly better performance, but it's failed by having outdated specs, and it begs the question, why exactly does the M2 MacBook Pro exist? Thank you guys for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button for others to see, as well as subscribing to the channel. My name is KJOS, and I will catch you guys in the next one where I talk all things tech.